Some of you, if you weren't spending the entire weekend grilling hot dogs outside, I saw a picture on Facebook over the weekend of some people locally who they built a nice open pit, fired a nice open pit, and then they were turning over the hot dogs in a rack. Oh gosh, that looked delicious. But a lot of people, of course, by the time you got to Sunday, and if you'd been up late Thursday night, and then you'd been up late Friday night, and then Saturday too. Yesterday, you might just decide to relax. It was a little cooler yesterday. I shut off the AC, opened up the windows, and just let the wind blow through. There was a NASCAR race. You may have just heard about that. It lasted well all day and well into the night because of rain delays. And that took place in Daytona. It's Coca-Cola 400. It's not the big 500 race that opens the season, but it takes place. There are only a handful of tracks that have a couple of races every year, and there's always these arguments about whether they should take some of the races away and give them to some other people. But NASCAR simply is looking at the number one. Daytona's a legendary track. You know, you're going to have Talladega and Darlington thrown in there, or you go to Dover a couple of times a year because Dover is close to three of the largest metropolitan areas in the country. And unlike what people who don't know anything about racing tend to believe, it is true, actually, that a lot of urban people watch it as well. And, you know, if you like automobiles, you like racing. I mean, that's just it. We've been racing horses. Now we race automobiles. And, you know, here in the Twin Falls area, we have a track, busy track that people, of course, you know, they look forward to it. Getting out there and just hearing that roar. When I was a kid, my dad was doing dirt track racing. And I can remember we would go, and my mom would take the three of us up into the stands, my sister, my brother, and we would sit about 14 rows up in a corner. And to this day, when when you're watching an old stock car race, there's nothing but a scrum on that slippery old track. And they'd come down into that corner, and as they would corner and fishtail, that mud and that dirt would come flying up into the stands, and 14 rows up where we had our seats, we'd get a face full of that. I learned to love the taste of dirt. 909, Bill Colley with you, 72. Thank you for joining me on Top Story today on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. So NASCAR, despite you've got a lot of people in the cities watching, is still a sport, though, that has its base in rural America. I'm not saying Southern America. People tend to forget that in rural parts of Idaho, rural parts of upstate New York where I grew up, rural parts of Minnesota, rural parts of Nevada, you have people who are racing fans, rural Canadians who are racing fans. But it remains very much a sport, though, with its history that is still centered in the Deep South. And as some of you know, because of the recent media ginned-up controversy over Southern flags, including the old battle flag from the Army of Northern Virginia, which is often mistakenly identified as the Confederate flag. It's one of many flags used by Confederate forces in the field. The Confederacy had three flags. The one that gets displayed most prominently was not one of them, but it has become a source for many people of Southern pride. Well, NASCAR, which is also a source of Southern pride, the France family, I guess they just decided to shoot their toes off. They came out and said that they were opposed to the use of the flag, that the flag should be put away in a closet or in a museum and forever forgotten or burned or shredded or whatever. And they urged fans not to bring the flags to the track. Well, you know, the one thing you can say about people who like automobile racing, they're the same people who cling, as President Obama once famously said, or infamously said, to their God and their guns. They brought their flags to Daytona. There are photographs today, and it's got the folks at the Washington Post just steam coming out of their ears because you dumb dummies won't follow our instructions. People brought out their flags in droves. And yet NASCAR offered, they said, if you turn in your Confederate flags, we'll give you a fresh new American flag. And there's a photograph that shows a couple of guards, attendants, standing next to the box filled with American flags, and nobody's taking any. Most of these people already have their American flags. Look, they showed the photographs from the parking lots and various places in the newspaper. Well, its website today. Most of these people who are flying a Confederate flag, or some of the flags are somewhat Confederate flags, and they'll have like a number 3 in the middle of them for the late Dale Earnhardt Sr. They themed them for the actual NASCAR event. but they all fly the American flag above these other flags. So the Confederate flag isn't even as high as perhaps the POW MIA flag, but it is, and some of the actual just flags for different drivers. But the public has spoken, hasn't it? I mean, wouldn't you say that if they showed up in droves with the flags? Now, if NASCAR decides it's going to go around and start confiscating these flags, then they're going to have a problem with their business model. Because if you start annoying people who actually come and pay the ticket prices, which are not necessarily cheap, then I think you're going to have trouble. Let me put it this way. No Cabernet sipping crowd in Manhattan or Long Beach is ever going to adopt NASCAR. And the notion that if you ban the flag, that somehow they'll go, yes, I've always been a huge fan, and now that the flag is gone, a symbol of racism and oppression, I guess I can go to a race. It's not going to happen. 73. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and NewsRadio1310.com. Wouldn't it be nice, instead of all of this knee-jerk liberalism and reaction that we constantly have, if people instead would pay attention to what works when it comes to business and maybe listen to the client base periodically? You can reach the show at 736-0300, 736-0300, or drop me an email at bill.colley@townsquaremedia.com. Tammy Bruce, writing in the Washington Times today, says, we're also seeing a bizarre general hysteria to banish down the memory hole symbols reflecting an entire segment of our history. We're even hearing calls that we strip highways and roads of the names of Confederate military figures. And then there is the toy car problem. Warner Brothers, of course, announcing it was halting production of the General Lee toy cars from the Dukes of Hazzard, which is one of the top-selling toys of all time. But hey, yeah, we'll cut our throats. Why not? Someone else can go ahead and get the licensing and do it, I suppose. Charles Krauthammer, she says, notes, and some of you are familiar with him from his newspaper column as well as his appearances on TV, quote, not every statue has to be smashed, not every memory banished, unquote. In Syria right now, ISIS is out smashing statues and destroying historic cities. How is that any different than an American liberal? It's 9:14. Here's something to contemplate. Yesterday in Tampa, Florida, not too far, as the crow flies, from Daytona, there was a Black Lives Matter rally. Or is it Matters? Well, anyway, you know what I'm talking about. This thing that started following Ferguson, Missouri, where a criminal was killed justifiably by a police officer. They decided to hold their Black Lives Matter rally, and they ended up burning an American flag and a Confederate flag in the middle of the rally. And even the reporters, many of whom are knee-jerk liberals themselves, well, 99.8% of them, even the reporters were appalled, saying, how can you expect to get the support of anyone when you've just burnt? And so one of the protesters said, well, it's a symbol of oppression, too. Aren't they playing into the hands? When liberals criticized Rush Limbaugh a couple of weeks ago, and he said that would be their next target, eliminate the Confederate flag, then eliminate the American flag, and everyone's, he's just another one of those slippery slope. We don't have slippery slope arguments. There won't be polygamy in this country. People won't be marrying cows and pigs, and all we want is civil unions. No. So Rush can't be right about a slippery slope argument. At an air base in Arizona over the weekend, you may have heard of this one. Some flags are more protected than other flags. Some flags the left wouldn't allow you to burn. Some fellow in base housing, on the base, at this air base in Arizona, is flying the rainbow flag. Well, it's got a blue field with stars, but then it has rainbow stripes. Now, if you know anything about uniform flag code, this is not supposed to happen on a military base. You have an airman who has complained. He will likely be disciplined for blowing the whistle. And right now, the Air Force was asked for its response, and it said, hemina, 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 hemina. The job of the United States Air Force is to defend the United States. It is not to provide a brothel for Johnny and Jimmy. Can we make that clear? And the American flag, especially on a military base, is supposed to be displayed according to that code, which includes the color of the stripes, how many stripes there are, This is very detailed. There's an actual photograph that I happen to see of this flag hanging outside. And sure enough, at first I thought it was a joke. But you look at it, and nobody in the military right now wants to say, enough, enough. Where does the lunacy come to an end? Because it's getting worse by the day. And some of the comments I saw over the weekend from people on Facebook, the American left has apparently been infected with rabies because the way they are frothing at the mouth and on the attack at the moment, odd for people whose only self-defense is to try and punch you like Curly Joe Besser, that they are so over the top right now, and that they believe somehow that they have vanquished forever traditional America. And yet I don't believe that, because today there is a survey that I happen to see in the Washington Examiner that says 70% of Americans surveyed think that the media is biased and trying to drive this train, and people are not happy about it. Well, what does that mean? Well, once we put the mainstream media to bed forever, then perhaps we'll finally start to turn things back around. This is why you got government that wants to control the internet, though, because those competing ideas out there do frighten them. 70% of Americans believe news media is intentionally biased. There was a great video also on the website of the Washington Examiner with us this morning. Only 19% of Americans say the First Amendment goes too far in the rights that it guarantees. Why would they even say that? Last year, 38% said it went too far, meaning support for the First Amendment has grown considerably. Well, it's leaps and bounds. 38% agree that business owners should be required to provide services to same-sex couples, a 14% drop from 2013 when the question was asked for the first time. 35% say the government, quote, should be allowed to deny issuing license plates to a group who intends to display a Confederate flag on the plates, unquote, while 56% oppose the idea. So you're starting to see perhaps the pushback, that perhaps Lefty has gone. There's a old story and movie called A Bridge Too Far about the effort to take a bridge at Arnhem and quickly end World War II in the Western Europe. And it just points out that sometimes you overreach. And it may well be that Lefty has finally met his Waterloo, there was a writer a couple of weeks ago who said they've reached the high water mark. And from this point on, it's only going to be receding. Got a couple of other thoughts, too, about that when it comes to that court case. Professor Jonathan Turley, who some of you are very familiar with, who has spoken out against the Obama administration, even though he's a Democrat, says that this same-sex marriage decision is going to essentially destroy the country, and he explains why. Well, we knew that, but no one wanted to listen. 73, 920. More on that coming up in a few minutes. Bill Colley with you on Top Story. Coming up on our program Wednesday, July 8th, we'll be talking with one of the medical professionals from Tripp Family Medicine right here in Twin Falls. Of course, we call it Better Health with Tripp Family Medicine. It airs between 8:30 and 9 o'clock on Wednesday mornings. Russell Singleton, who's a physician assistant, will be joining us this week. And he's going to recap a couple of things: diet and exercise, lifestyle changes, how you can actually track what you're eating. And sometimes maybe, when you hear, we have a talk show, a financial talk show that we air evenings here. And the host always likes to talk about keeping a household budget. Write everything down. Well, you can do the same thing when it comes to weight loss. So that's coming up. And if you have any questions this Wednesday, feel free to give us a call. You have an opportunity to talk directly to one of the health professionals. Tripp Family Medicine is located on Fillmore Street in Twin Falls, directly across from the main post office. And remember, life's too short not to feel good. 103 degrees, I was told, was the temperature Thursday afternoon when I went over to the College of Southern Idaho for Patriots Night. I know on my dashboard, the thermometer said 100 while I was rolling down the street. 103 wouldn't surprise me. And I was in a dark suit, and I was very hot, even inside, all through the evening. And I had to run outside for a moment, and that only complicated matters. I'm telling you right now, when you're indoors this time of year, you're trying to stay cool. One way you may do that, and it will reduce heat, is if you put tint in windows, whether it be automobile, home, or at the office. And you can call Tint Lady of Idaho if you'd like to do that. You'll reduce the heat with tint by almost 3/4 what comes through, and that'll save you too on the cooling bill. And they do free estimates. You can call and schedule an appointment today. The telephone number is 736-8469, or check them out at tintladyidaho.com. More than 20 years experience, locally owned and operated, 1887 Highland Avenue East in Twin Falls. They're open today, in fact, Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Saturdays by appointments, closed Sundays, and remember, don't squint, get tint. You know, you talk about how hot it gets inside an automobile. There's a figure on our website this morning at News Radio 1310 KLIX. You can check it out. You'll see a photograph of a dog. Right away, that'll be the key of what we're talking about. It's 9:26. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. 74. Recent test was done with all of the hot weather last week, and within just a matter of minutes, it was discovered that the front seat of a car could reach 141 degrees. 10 minutes time or so as that car is closed up. City of Ketchum is actually talking about increasing what you might call the punishment for people who would leave a dog in a car on a hot day. Oh, well, I cracked the window open a little bit, but we didn't want Snookums to get out. I love Snookums. That's why I cooked him. So I've seen this happen. A couple of weeks ago, I went shopping. It wasn't quite as hot as it was last week. It was probably only 95. I don't know, when 95-degree weather is beating through a window, how that's really any different than 100-degree weather. It's still pretty bad. Even on a day, I can remember years ago pulling into a parking lot, and it was probably about 40 degrees outside, but a beautifully sunny day, and someone had a dog in a car. Do you realize how quickly with that sun, even on a cooler day, how quickly that sun hitting that window, how it can warm up inside? And people don't seem to be able, well, I couldn't leave the dog at home. Why not? Why? How is the dog, better off because you cooked it instead? I do not understand this, and I'm seeing it more and more often, it seems. And you can't seem to get people to understand. Well, I cracked the window slightly, or I opened the sunroof slightly. Yeah, and the dog's still panning and struggling to breathe inside there. You wouldn't do that to a human being. You claim you love your dog, too. It's a member of the family. Why, then, are you torturing that animal? And as I say, I saw it happen a couple of weeks ago, and you can say something to someone. They usually don't like it. Some places you can't get. I went into a store one time and said someone's cooking their dog outside, and they said, well, it's not our responsibility. They said, we don't own the parking lot. Why don't you just lease it? I said, well, yeah, but again. And they said, well, we wouldn't want to offend any of our shoppers by embarrassing them. So go ahead and cook the dog, right? I ended up writing the corporate headquarters of Harris Teeter at the time, which is a Kroger-owned grocery chain in one part of the country. Nobody ever wrote me back. So I guess what I did, I perhaps just annoyed them by even bringing it up. But I reflected that I didn't want to shop at their store anymore if that happened to be the company policy, torturing small animals. And somebody apparently thought I was a little too over the top and declined to reply to my message. And one time when I was living in the state of Vermont many, many years ago, a guy was cooking his dog in a pickup truck, and I opened the door just to try to get the dog out, which I shouldn't have done. I'm told I could have been arrested for doing that. And then the dog ran down the street. I was able to finally catch the dog, corral it, and I brought it back. And guess what? The guy who owned it was a local school teacher. I guess he was trying to set an example for the children by cooking his dog in the parking lot outside the grocery store. And everybody always says, it was only gone a few minutes. And yet you could stand there with your watch and you can time 25, 30. What do they mean, just a few? So I don't know that this has reached an endemic or pandemic in the state of Idaho. But I'm telling you, put yourself in the place of your dog. And then ask if you'd want the dog to come along and lock you in the car while you're in the store gabbing for half an hour. It's 9:30. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. No, you're not a creepy person at all. You just torture small animals. 75. I've got more coming up. Dr. Jonathan Turley's comments on same-sex marriage. A number of my friends are planning to we hope we can do this before the end of the current baseball season. But what we're planning on is meeting in a major league city and going to a ball game before the end of the current season. And I used to, I admit, I lived in an area where I had three ballparks, major league ballparks, all within about 2 hours drive. Oh, it was glorious. If you sometimes we would say, well, we'll go to Philadelphia this week, then next week we'll do Baltimore, and then after that we'll do Washington, and then we'll repeat that. So somebody was asking me the other day, what are the closest major league ballparks? And I said, somebody said, is it Denver? I said, no, I don't think so. Seattle might be closer. Oakland and San Francisco might be closer. And then one of my coworkers went to San Francisco a few weeks ago, and I think he said even with traffic, it was only about a 9-hour drive. So I said to one of the guys, well, we could go to San Francisco. They've got that beautiful park. I should note, by the way, that the world champion Giants, they got clubbed over the last 3 days, and I'm wearing the hat on my head right now of the clubbers. But that's just a wonderful feeling. Because you know what? You weren't the best team last year. No. It's just, you got the best manager maybe. He got himself booted from the game after 5 innings yesterday. But I said to a friend we could do San Francisco. He said, I am not going to San Francisco. He said, it's a wretched city. Over the weekend, apparently, this came from Breitbart News. Gay celebration trashes newly renovated Dolores Park. Out of San Francisco, locals are still reeling after last weekend's gay pride celebration saw Dolores Park trashed by revelers. It was only recently reopened after an expensive renovation. The San Francisco Chronicle blamed the timing of the event and the park's design. No, it can't possibly be the unruly crowd. No, we can't say that. It might hurt their feelings, and then they would sue us for being hateful and spiteful and mean, and we wouldn't want that because we wouldn't want to deny them even a newspaper. The trouble with the dignity of same-sex marriage. I wanted to get to this earlier in the show and squeeze it in right now if we can have an opportunity. 936. There's a story in the newspaper out of Nampa today. Was it the Press Tribune? Whining that the state constitution still says that marriage is defined between a man and a woman, and that Idaho needs to go rewrite that. Well, the U.S. Supreme Court already rewrote it, right? Jonathan Turley, professor of constitutional law, perhaps one of the best known in the country, writing in the Washington Post, criticizing Justice Anthony Kennedy. He found a right to marriage based not on the status of the couples as homosexuals, but rather on the right of everyone to the, quote, dignity, unquote, of marriage. Look, I've been married, and I'll tell you what, calling it dignity sometimes is a bit of a stretch. For the record, Turley writes, I have long advocated the recognition of same-sex marriage, but the most direct way the justices could have arrived at their conclusion would have been to rely on the Equal Protection Clause in the Fourth Amendment, along with civil rights legislation passed 50 years ago, holds that all citizens are entitled to the same treatment under the law, no matter race, sex, religion, or other attributes known as, quote, protected classes, unquote. In other words, some Americans are more equal than other Americans. Dignity is a rather elusive and malleable concept, he writes, compared with more concrete qualities such as race and sex. It is clearly undignified for a gay couple to be denied a wedding cake with a homosexual theme, yet for a Christian or a Muslim baker, it might also feel undignified to be forced to prepare an image celebrating same-sex marriage should the right to dignity trump free speech or the free exercise of your religion. And that's a question mark at the end. Could employees challenge workplace dress codes as intruding upon their right to, quote, define and express their identity, unquote? Could these subject to college admissions preferences raise claims that race or gender classifications deny their individual effort to, quote, define and express their identity, unquote? Kennedy's approach has only deepened the uncertainty over how courts will handle such cases. Some of the greatest attacks on dignity are too often found in the exercise of free speech. He says that comes from Canada and England, where they have outlawed many. Well, the Baptist preacher in England was arrested and tried because he was preaching against certain relations from a biblical perspective. So now they're outlawing the Bible, essentially, in England. We should notice they're being overrun by a bunch of immigrants from the Muslim world. Not that that would ever happen here. In the United States, he writes, such efforts have been largely stymied by the express protection of free speech in the First Amendment. and interpretations by the courts. Nevertheless, pressure is rising to criminalize forms of, quote, hate speech, unquote, or speech that is viewed as discriminatory or degrading to certain groups. And he says the case that was recently ruled upon would be a tragic irony if it succeeded in finally closing the door on morality and speech codes, only to introduce an equally ill-defined identity or dignity code. Substituting compulsory morality with compulsory liberalism simply shifts the burden of coercive state power from one group to another. He's also reflecting that we've opened the door. This dignity argument means we've opened the door to polygamy and, incest, because the court ruling said, well, we're recognizing the dignity because people's attitudes have changed as well. Well, okay. If attitudes are just malleable themselves, then why not horses, cows, and pigs? Well, we'll find out. 9:40. Bill Colley with you this morning on Top Story. Mike Gallagher coming up in 10 minutes. Hope you can stick around. This is going to be a wonderful day ahead. Monday morning, we're now in high summer. How could it get any better? Last week, we were having a conversation on air, and it seemed to generate, no pun intended, some response from some of the listening audience about all of the giant pinwheels we have that are blowing across the land. And we're told that these are going to be allow us to have renewable energy and to make us energy independent. Wall Street Journal takes a different or dim view of that today. 9:44, Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. It's 76. You can reach our program at 736-0300. This is in the commentary section of the newspaper, Obama's Renewable Energy Fantasy. Bill Gates recently noted that the cost of decarbonization using today's technology is beyond astronomical. That's the subheadline. On June 30, one day after the Supreme Court, that was last Tuesday, struck down the Environmental Protection Agency's regulation of mercury emissions from power plants, the president committed the United States to the goal of generating 20% of its electricity from renewable sources. That means his belching and flatulence, I guess. Joe Biden's got a lot of that, too. It's electricity from sources by 2030. This would nearly triple the amount of wind and solar-generated electricity on the national grid. How many more of these things can we put up before we don't have any room to even, move around? The EPA ran afoul of the law by failing to conduct a cost-benefit analysis before it acted to reduce mercury emissions from coal power plants. And then they refer back to Bill Gates explaining in an interview with the Financial Times why current renewables are dead-end technologies. They are unreliable. Battery storage is inadequate. Wind and solar output depends on the weather. Google engineers came to a similar conclusion last year. Germany passed its first renewable law 20 years ago and already has spent $351 billion. That would be converted from their euro, which I've avoided talking about so far today because other people will be getting into all the greasy discussion. The German environment minister has estimated a cost of up to $877 billion by the end of the 2030s, with an economy nearly 5 times as large as Germany's, at least for the time being, I suppose, and generating nearly 7 times the amount of electricity, but a less demanding renewable target. This would suggest that the cost of meeting Mr. Obama's pledge is $2 trillion. Well, last week they officially said that we were now over $19 trillion in debt in this country. What's a couple of more trillion? Wow. High and rising energy costs are driving German companies to locate new capacity overseas. In other words, because of the cost of energy in Germany, that roaring economy they built there following the reunification of that country, and really in the western side of it, long before that happened, is now being jeopardized because they can't afford it. And again, Bill Gates, who's an uber liberal, is saying we can't do this. It's bankruptcy. It's clearly bankruptcy. Now, again, why don't we listen? 9:47. You're on the air with Bill Colley on Top Story.
Yes, and it's so ridiculous. I was traveling on July the 2nd, and it was 100 degrees, and down by American Falls, there's a humongous, big, wind-generating complex there. Nothing was turning. So when you really need these things, yeah, there was enough. And then coming back yesterday afternoon, there was wind blowing, but out of the 25, 30 of them, there was about 6 or so that I counted that weren't working. They weren't working. So, the upkeep, there's no such thing as a sustainable wind generator. I mean, the cost of putting those things up, if it wasn't for us taxpayers subsidizing all of this, it would never exist in the first place.
Yeah, I just, every time I see these things barely spinning around, I should point out, I drove to Boise one day a couple of months ago, and the wind was so intense, it looked like a herd stomping down the road with all of the tumbleweeds and just, flying by me, but yet I didn't really see the turbines moving much at all.
Well, and what they're also doing, Bill, as you probably know, that in order to give the appearance that something is happening, they installed electric motors on some of them so that they will power them up so they look like they're running when they're not really generating anything. They're actually a net loss because they're using power off the regular grid to move the propellers around.
Wouldn't that be just a little dishonest?
Oh, it's worse than dishonest. It's just like you say with Germany, this is going to happen to this country too unless people wake up and stop the EPA.
We'll have the best of both parts of Europe. We'll have the Greek debt and we'll have the German energy problem.
There you bet. That's exactly right. You bet. Have a great day.
All right. Thank you. Thank you much for the call. And by the way, we should point out I was going to avoid Greece altogether today, but because other people will talk about it. But if I could just briefly mention this. I was reading today in the Federalist, and I've been seeing some rumblings about this over the course of the last week. But China's stock market is in a meltdown and has been for about 3 weeks. I mean, it is a rapid meltdown. Now, the Chinese have $21 trillion in cash reserves. That's opposed to our officially $19 trillion in debt. So they've used $19 trillion of that $21 trillion to try to prop up the markets. And because the Chinese got leery of investing in housing and real estate markets, they've been putting all their money into the stock market there. Whew, they're losing their shirts. That could swamp a lot of smaller boats. Coming up, Mike Gallagher, brought to you exclusively by the financial advisors at Waddell & Reed in Twin Falls, 736-6563. And I want to thank Mike Gallagher. Coming up on 9:54:76. Bill Colley with you for a few more minutes this morning. Just a quick note. Glenn Beck, you will only be hearing him, I guess, sporadically over the next few weeks. Glenn Beck has been diagnosed. We got a heads up this morning here at the radio station. We carry his program at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 4 till 7. Glenn Beck has been diagnosed. He strained his vocal cords. I don't know, maybe shouting at a fireworks show. Or perhaps shouting at one of the morons who called into the program. But he's going to be taking a little time off to rest his voice over the coming weeks. And just to let you know that the two guys who work with him and do a really remarkable job, they'll be picking up a lot of the slack over the next few weeks. Beck is still able to write, and he'll still be doing that at the Blaze. Hey, quick note. I wanted to share this if I could, because I was talking about it a little earlier in the program today. Anna Workman just dropped me a note about Patriots Night last Thursday here at the College of Southern Idaho. And I went down to paragraph 2, and I would like to share this. She writes, "We were able to make enough money for 3 scholarships and are pleased that everyone there was excited and grateful for the opportunity to share in the evening and see the tribute and concert. The feedback has been very positive." I do have to say, it turned out to be, sometimes in life, you feel you've got roadblocks. And I know a lot of people out there in the modern age think that we're crazy if we reference that we have roadblocks thrown up in our lives by the deceiver, that is, the evildoer. And yet I come from a background in my religious faith where I believe strongly that we are fighting against that constantly, and it is always probing. But I was just having a week last week where everything I did, if I tried to pick up a box, I dropped the box and I spilled everything on the floor. I was dropping dishes. I went home one day and I was opening up a can, and in fact, it was last week, Thursday, before I had to go to this event, and I got gravy all over me. It just popped right out of the can and all over the front of me. Luckily, I was not in the suit. The shirt that I had to buy to wear to the event, because I have a 39-inch sleeve, I had to order it. It was late coming in. So I had to go buy an iron before the speech that I had to give that night to iron the shirt. So I was trying to mist the shirt, but then it looked like the water stained the shirt. Not that that mattered, because when I got outside and it was 103 degrees and I was wearing a dark suit and I was going to this event, I produced enough water of my own. I had to keep telling people during the evening, I'm not having a heart attack. I'm the only guy here in a dark suit. That's why. And yet I went through all of this, and then I broke a shoestring before I had to go on stage. And so I had a wingtip on my left foot that was going clump, 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 and digging into the back of my left heel, which is always very pleasant. You know, it focuses you rather directly on your heel versus your head, which you need if you're going to be giving a speech. So I sat down with a pen in the green room and rethreaded as best I could what was left of the shoestring. And I got the shoestring tied and finally got out on stage and offered my remarks. And I was surprised I got through them as well as I did, because it was almost as if that was just a test for me all week long with all of these bizarre things that were happening. And I was talking to Dave Bray from Madison Rising after the show, and I said, Dave, I avoided talking with you guys and shaking hands with you guys until you were off the stage, because after the week I had, I didn't want to share any of that. Now, Dave was reflecting in our conversation that he remembered meeting me the very first time Madison Rising ever played publicly, did a live show 5 years ago. September, in fact. It was Constitution Day in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and I happened to be there to see the show. I traveled a long distance to see the show with a friend, and he remembered talking with me that day, and then he's been on radio shows with me other places since then. And I told him about, that I was worried about putting the hex on them. And he said, yeah, wouldn't that be a terrible bookend? See our first live performance and then see our last. But it was truly a tremendous evening. And I just, again, I'll take that one with me forever. 9:58, Bill Colley with you. Rush Limbaugh scheduled following news. The program following news at 10 o'clock. God willing, and the creek don't rise, they allow me to do this all over again tomorrow morning between 8 and 10 o'clock. And I hope you have a great start to your week.